My name is Hazel Crawford, and I'm 28 years old. I thought I was attending my sister's engagement party at our family's Connecticut mansion, but I was actually walking into my own execution. The crystal chandelier cast shadows across the marble floor as I watched my parents hand Charlotte a check for $55 million. My heart stopped when my father turned to me with cold eyes and said, "Pack one suitcase, Hazel. You have 30 minutes to leave this house forever." The security guards were already walking toward me. Before we dive into how my own family destroyed my life, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you're ready for a story about betrayal that goes deeper than you could ever imagine, and don't forget to subscribe because this journey is about to get intense. Trust me, what happened next will shock you to your core. Growing up in the Crawford household meant living in Charlotte's shadow every single day. She was 3 years older and could do no wrong in our parents' eyes, while I couldn't breathe without being criticized. When Charlotte broke Mom's antique vase at age 7, I got blamed for leaving it where she could reach it. When she failed her driving test twice, Dad bought her a new BMW to practice with. When I graduated summa cum laude from Boston University, they forgot to attend because Charlotte had a dentist appointment that same day. What I didn't understand until that devastating night was how calculated it all was. Our family's real estate empire, Crawford Properties, was built on the foundation of my grandmother's inheritance that she had left equally to both Charlotte and me. Grandmother Eleanor had been the one person who truly loved me, who saw my worth when my parents couldn't. She died when I was 16, and I was told the money would come to me when I turned 25. That day came and went 3 years ago with nothing but excuses. Charlotte had been systematically poisoning our parents against me for decades. She told them I was jealous, unstable, ungrateful. She convinced them that giving me access to grandmother's money would be a mistake because I'd wasted on my frivolous marketing career. Meanwhile, she positioned herself as the responsible daughter who deserved everything. Her engagement to Derek Wellington wasn't about love, it was a business merger between two powerful families. Derek's father was a senator, his mother came from old money, and together they represented the kind of political and social connections that could elevate our family's status beyond anything we'd achieved in real estate. The night of the party, I finally saw the family lawyer, Mr. Peterson, pull me aside with documents that made my blood run cold. I had been completely written out of the will. Not just reduced, not just delayed, eliminated entirely. Everything grandmother Eleanor had intended for me was now Charlotte's. The $55 million wasn't just an engagement gift, it was my inheritance being handed over to fund their wedding and new life together. The first betrayal that night came from someone I never expected. Sophia Martinez had been my best friend since college, the maid of honor in a wedding I'd never have, the person I called when I needed support. But when Charlotte made her announcement about the money, Sophia was the first to congratulate her. Later, when my parents made their cold announcement that I needed to leave, Sophia avoided my eyes completely. I cornered her in the bathroom, desperate for one ally in that room full of enemies. "Sophia, you know this is insane, right? You know Charlotte has been lying about me for years. You've seen how they treat me." But Sophia just fixed her lipstick in the mirror and shrugged. "Hazel, maybe it's time you accepted that Charlotte has always been the successful one. Some people are just born winners." She paused, meeting my eyes in the reflection. "Besides, Derek's family has connections that could really help my public relations firm. I can't afford to burn bridges over your family drama." Standing there in my childhood bathroom, watching my best friend choose social climbing over loyalty, I realized how completely alone I was. Everyone in that house had made their choice, and it wasn't me. 3 months after being thrown out of my family home, I was living in a 400-square-foot studio apartment in Hartford that smelled like mold and had heating that worked maybe half the time. My job as a marketing coordinator at a small tech startup barely covered rent and groceries, let alone the lawyer I desperately needed. The apartment was a far cry from the sprawling estate I'd grown up on, but it was all I could afford after my parents cut off my credit cards and froze the small trust fund I'd had access to for college expenses. The isolation was the worst part. Charlotte had been busy spreading her poison throughout our social circle, telling anyone who would listen that I had been stealing from the family business for years. She painted me as a jealous, unstable sister who couldn't handle her success. The story she crafted was that I'd been embezzling money from Crawford Properties, and that's why our parents had finally taken action. People I'd known for years started avoiding me, crossing the street when they saw me coming, declining my calls. I spent my evenings in the public library, using their computers to research everything I could about inheritance law and estate disputes. That's where I first found references to James Morrison, a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud cases. His website mentioned that he'd worked with families dealing with inheritance disputes, and something about his approach seemed different from the slick lawyers who wanted retainers I couldn't afford. James was in his early 40s, with graying temples and kind eyes that had seen too much of humanity's darker side. When I met him at a small cafe near his office, I expected him to dismiss my story as the ramblings of a bitter daughter. Instead, he listened carefully, taking notes, asking specific questions about dates and documents. When I mentioned my grandmother's name, his entire demeanor changed. "Eleanor Crawford," he said slowly. "I knew her, actually. She hired me about 15 years ago to look into some irregularities with her late husband's business partners. She was one of the smartest, most ethical people I've ever worked with." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "She talked about her granddaughters sometimes. She was worried about you, specifically worried about how your parents treated you versus Charlotte." That revelation hit me like lightning. James explained that my grandmother had come to him because she suspected that her son, my father, was already showing signs of favoritism that could lead to problems down the road. She'd been careful to structure her will to prevent exactly what was happening now. According to James, there was no legal way my parents could have simply removed me from an inheritance that was specifically designated in my grandmother's will. We started investigating the family finances, and what we found made my stomach turn. There were discrepancies everywhere. Money that should have been in protected trusts had been moved around, invested in risky ventures, used as collateral for business deals that had nothing to do with the original terms of my grandmother's estate. But more disturbing was what we discovered about Charlotte herself. She hadn't just been the golden child coasting on parental favoritism. For the past 5 years, she'd been systematically embezzling from Crawford Properties. Small amounts at first, then larger sums as she got bolder. She'd created fake vendors, inflated expense reports, even sold property and pocketed portions of the proceeds by manipulating the books. The total amount was close to $2 million, money she'd used to fund her lavish lifestyle and probably to pay for information about me that she could use against me. I thought I'd found an ally when Uncle Robert, my father's younger brother, reached out to me a few weeks into my investigation. He'd always been the more reasonable member of the family, the one who occasionally stood up for me during family gatherings. He invited me to lunch and listened sympathetically as I explained what James and I had discovered. "I always suspected something wasn't right," he said, shaking his head sadly. "The way they treated you compared to Charlotte never made sense to me. And now this money situation." He promised to look into it from his position within the family business, to see what he could find out about the financial irregularities we'd uncovered. I was so grateful for his support that I shared everything with him. Every document James had found, every lead we were pursuing, every piece of evidence that could prove Charlotte's theft and my parents' mismanagement of grandmother's estate. I thought finally, I had someone in the family who would stand up for what was right. 2 days later, my parents' lawyer called James and threatened him with a lawsuit if he continued investigating the Crawford family finances. Somehow, they knew every detail of what we'd discovered, every document we'd requested, every lead we'd been following. Uncle Robert had reported everything back to them, choosing family loyalty over justice. The betrayal cut even deeper than Sophia's because I'd been so desperate for someone, anyone, to believe in me. James Morrison wasn't the type to be intimidated by legal threats, especially when they came from lawyers trying to hide something. Instead of backing down, he doubled his efforts, and what we uncovered in the following weeks made my family's betrayal look like a small part of a much larger, more sinister picture. Derek Wellington's family wasn't just wealthy and politically connected, they were dirty in ways that made my stomach turn. James had contacts in law enforcement, journalists who'd been investigating white-collar crime for decades, and through them we learned about the Wellington family's history. Derek's father, Senator Richard Wellington, had been involved in defense contract scandals, environmental cover-ups, and had used his political position to eliminate business rivals through regulatory harassment. Derek himself had learned those lessons well. The marriage between Charlotte and Derek wasn't just about combining wealth, it was about creating a money laundering operation that would legitimize years of illegal profits from both families. James showed me documents that revealed how they planned to merge Crawford Properties with Wellington Development Group in a way that would allow them to wash dirty money through legitimate real estate transactions. But the more we dug, the more we realized that my parents weren't just complicit, they were being blackmailed. Charlotte had evidence of their early business crimes, back when Crawford Properties was first getting established 30 years ago. Dad had cut corners on building codes, bribed city officials, used mob connections to intimidate competitors. Mom had been the one keeping 2 sets of books, hiding income from the IRS, creating shell companies to hide assets. Charlotte had somehow obtained proof of all of it, and she was using it to control them completely. The missing piece came when James tracked down Mr. Peterson, our family attorney, at his favorite restaurant. James had learned that Peterson had a gambling problem, debts that would destroy his law practice if they became public. Charlotte had been paying those debts in exchange for his help in manipulating legal documents, including my grandmother's will. Peterson hadn't just failed to protect my interests, he'd actively participated in stealing them. We were getting close to proof that could bring down the entire conspiracy when James made a discovery that changed everything. My grandmother had been smarter than any of us realized. 6 months before her death, she'd opened a safety deposit box at a small community bank in New Hampshire, near the summer cottage where she'd taken Charlotte and me as children. She'd told no one about it except for her longtime secretary, Mrs. Helen Chen, who had worked for the family for over 20 years before retiring. Mrs. Chen lived in a small house in Vermont now, tending her garden and keeping to herself. When James and I showed up at her door, she took one look at me and started crying. "You look so much like her," she said, inviting us in for tea. "Eleanor worried about you every single day. She knew what your parents were doing, how they favored Charlotte, and she tried so hard to protect you." Mrs. Chen had the key to the safety deposit box and a letter my grandmother had written specifically for me. In that letter, my grandmother explained everything. She'd discovered Charlotte's manipulation years before her death, had seen how my parents were being twisted against me, and had taken steps to protect my inheritance that went far beyond what anyone knew. The safety deposit box contained the original, unaltered version of her will, documents proving the illegal changes that had been made, and evidence she'd collected of Charlotte's early attempts to steal from the family business. Reading my grandmother's words, knowing that she'd seen what was happening and had tried to protect me, gave me strength I hadn't felt in months. But it also made me realize how much danger I was in. If Charlotte had been willing to manipulate legal documents and blackmail our parents, what would she do when she found out we had evidence that could destroy her? I got my answer the next week when I was fired from my job. My supervisor, Lisa, called me into her office with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Hazel. I know this isn't fair, but we received a call from someone claiming you've been using company resources for personal business, that you've been dishonest about your background. They provided documentation that we have to take seriously." Charlotte's retaliation had begun, and she was just getting started. Losing my job meant I was 3 weeks away from eviction, with no prospects and a reputation that Charlotte had successfully destroyed throughout my professional network. Every company I applied to either rejected me outright or stopped returning my calls after what I assumed were conversations with Charlotte or her allies. She'd crafted a narrative that followed me everywhere. The unstable daughter who'd been caught stealing from her family, who was now desperately trying to blame everyone else for her problems. The media campaign was the most devastating part. Charlotte had always been socially savvy, but now she used those skills to destroy me systematically. She gave a tearful interview to the local newspaper about how difficult it was to have a sister with mental health issues who couldn't accept that life wasn't fair. She posted carefully crafted social media messages about family loyalty and dealing with sibling rivalry that painted me as jealous and delusional without ever mentioning my name directly. Derek's political connections made everything worse. Within days of Mrs. Chin giving us access to my grandmother's safety deposit box, I received notice that I was being investigated for fraud by both state and federal authorities. Someone had filed reports claiming I'd been forging documents, impersonating family members to access financial records, and possibly threatening witnesses in an inheritance dispute. The investigation was led by prosecutors who had received generous campaign contributions from the Wellington family. The police raid on my tiny apartment came at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. I woke up to pounding on my door and shouts of police. "Open up!" When I let them in, they had a warrant to search for evidence of financial fraud, forgery, and criminal harassment. They tore through my few belongings, confiscated my laptop, my phone, every document I had related to the investigation of my family's finances. The worst part was what they found. Hidden in a box under my bed was a check made out to me for $50,000, supposedly from Crawford Properties. I'd never seen it before in my life, but it had my signature on it, or what looked like my signature. There were also printouts of emails that appeared to come from my account, threatening various members of my family and demanding money. None of it was real, but it was sophisticated enough that proving it would require forensic analysis I couldn't afford. Sitting in the police station, handcuffed to a chair while they processed the evidence they'd found, I came closer to giving up than I ever had. Everything I'd worked for was gone. My family had disowned me, my friends had abandoned me, my career was destroyed, and now I was facing criminal charges for crimes I hadn't committed. James Morrison was the only person left who believed in my innocence, but even he was starting to worry that we were in over our heads. That night, alone in my apartment that had been torn apart by the police search, I seriously considered just walking away. I could take what little money I had left, get on a bus to somewhere like Oregon or Montana, start over with a new name and forget the Crawford family had ever existed. The fight was destroying me, and for what? Money that might not even exist anymore? Justice that seemed impossible to achieve? I was researching bus routes when my phone rang. The number was blocked, but something made me answer it. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "Ms. Crawford? This is Vincent Torres. I used to be Derek Wellington's business partner, and I believe we have some things to discuss. I've been watching your situation from a distance, and I think I might be able to help you understand what you're really dealing with." Vincent explained that he'd been Derek's partner in several business ventures before their relationship soured over Derek's willingness to use violence to solve business problems. Vincent had evidence of Derek's criminal activities, including financial records that proved the Wellington family's money laundering operations, but he'd been afraid to come forward because he'd seen what happened to people who crossed Derek. "There was a woman before your sister," Vincent told me. Derek was engaged to Jennifer Walsh, a young lawyer who started asking too many questions about his family's finances. She disappeared 2 years ago. The police said she must have run away, started a new life somewhere, but I know what really happened to her. Vincent's revelation made me realize that this wasn't just about money anymore. Charlotte and Derek weren't just thieves, they were dangerous in ways I hadn't understood. But Vincent's willingness to finally speak up also meant I wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in months, I had a real ally, someone with inside knowledge who could help me fight back. The war was about to begin. Vincent Torres met me at a small diner outside Hartford at 2 a.m, choosing a place where we were unlikely to be seen by anyone connected to either of our families. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with intelligent dark eyes and the careful manner of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. He'd brought a thick folder of documents and a laptop that he guarded carefully. "Before I show you any of this," he said, "you need to understand what you're getting into. Derek Wellington isn't just wealthy and well-connected. He's genuinely dangerous. The things I'm about to share with you could get both of us killed if he finds out. Vincent had been Derek's partner in a private equity firm that specialized in acquiring distressed properties and flipping them for massive profits. What Vincent hadn't realized when they started working together was that Derek was using their legitimate business as a front for money laundering, tax evasion, and occasionally, eliminating people who got in the way. The documents Vincent showed me revealed a pattern that made my blood run cold. Over the past 5 years, Derek had been involved in the disappearances of 3 people who'd threatened his family's interests. Jennifer Walsh, his former fiancée, had been a federal prosecutor who'd started investigating defense contracts that Derek's father had influenced. A real estate developer named Michael Chung had discovered that Derek was manipulating environmental impact studies to push through profitable developments. A journalist named Patricia Novak had been investigating the Wellington family's political corruption. All 3 had vanished without a trace, their disappearances explained away as voluntary departures, nervous breakdowns, or decisions to start new lives somewhere else. But Vincent had proof that Derek had been involved in all 3 cases, including financial records showing payments to a private security company that specialized in problems requiring permanent solutions. "Your sister knows," Vincent told me, his voice grim. "Charlotte knows exactly what kind of man she's marrying. She's not just complicit, she's actively participating. She helped plan Jennifer's disappearance because Jennifer was getting too close to evidence that would have implicated both families." That revelation hit me like a physical blow. My sister wasn't just a manipulative favorite child who'd stolen my inheritance. She was an accessory to murder, someone who'd chosen money and status over human life. The scope of what I was facing suddenly seemed overwhelming, but Vincent wasn't finished. He'd been documenting Derek's crimes for 2 years, ever since their business relationship ended badly, but he'd been too frightened to take action. Derek had made it clear that Vincent's silence was the only thing keeping him alive. But watching what they were doing to me, seeing the systematic destruction of an innocent person, had finally pushed him to act. "I can't live with myself if I stay quiet while they destroy you the way they destroyed Jennifer," he said. "But if we're going to do this, we have to be smart about it. Derek has people in law enforcement, in the media, in the legal system. We can't just hand evidence to the police and hope for the best." We spent the next 3 hours planning a strategy that would protect us while building a case that couldn't be ignored or covered up. Vincent would continue to appear loyal to Derek while secretly gathering additional evidence. I would focus on my grandmother's documents and work with James Morrison to build the inheritance case. Together, we'd document everything and prepare a comprehensive package that we could release to multiple law enforcement agencies and media outlets simultaneously. The first step was catching Charlotte in the act of confessing to her crimes. Vincent arranged for Derek to invite me to a fake reconciliation meeting, supposedly to discuss settling our family dispute privately. Charlotte agreed to attend, confident that she could manipulate me into accepting a small payoff in exchange for dropping my inheritance claims. I wore a wire provided by Vincent and met them at a restaurant in an upscale hotel in downtown Hartford. Charlotte played her part perfectly, the concerned older sister who just wanted our family to heal. But when I pressed her about the financial irregularities James and I had discovered, her mask began to slip. "Look, Hazel," she said, leaning forward with the patronizing tone she'd used on me since childhood, "you have to understand that grandmother's money was never really yours. She was getting senile toward the end, making decisions that didn't make sense. Dad and I had to make some adjustments to protect the family's interests." She went on to admit that she'd been managing family finances in ways that weren't strictly legal, but that everything she'd done was for the good of the family business. She even laughed when I brought up the missing $2 million, explaining that she'd reinvested that money in opportunities that would benefit everyone in the long run. The recording was damning, but we needed more. Vincent had discovered that Derek was using their wedding planning as a cover for money laundering, bringing in illegal funds through fake vendor payments and inflated venue costs. The IRS investigation I'd anonymously prompted based on Vincent's financial records was already beginning, and federal agents were starting to ask questions about the Wellington family's sudden increase in wedding-related expenses. My parents, terrified by the federal attention, finally began to realize that Charlotte had manipulated them into a situation that could destroy everything they'd built. Dad tried to reach out to me through Uncle Robert, wanting to discuss a settlement that would give me a portion of my inheritance in exchange for dropping any legal challenges. But it was too late for half measures. Charlotte's response to losing control was swift and vicious. 2 days after our recorded conversation, I received a call from Adult Protective Services saying they'd received reports that I was experiencing a mental health crisis and might be a danger to myself or others. The caller explained that they were required to investigate, and that if the reports were substantiated, I could be involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation. The trap was closing around me, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't facing it alone. Vincent and James had my back, and we had evidence that could bring down the entire conspiracy. The question was whether we could use it before Charlotte and Derek eliminated the threat I represented the same way they'd eliminated Jennifer Walsh. The psychiatric commitment attempt came at 4:30 in the morning, exactly the time when someone experiencing a mental health crisis would be most vulnerable and disoriented. I woke up to knocking on my apartment door and a woman identifying herself as Dr. Sarah Martinez from Hartford Hospital's crisis intervention team. She explained that they'd received multiple reports about my behavior suggesting I might be experiencing a psychotic break and could be dangerous. Multiple reports turned out to mean statements from Charlotte, Derek, my parents, and even Uncle Robert, all describing increasingly erratic behavior, paranoid delusions about family conspiracies, and threats I'd supposedly made against family members. They'd crafted a narrative that painted my investigation into their crimes as evidence of mental illness, and they'd found medical professionals willing to act on their fabricated concerns. I'd been expecting something like this thanks to Vincent's warnings about Derek's methods, so I wasn't completely unprepared. James Morrison was waiting in his car outside my apartment building, ready to document the attempted commitment and provide legal intervention if necessary. More importantly, I had copies of all our evidence stored in multiple locations, including with a lawyer Vincent had recommended who specialized in defending targets of political persecution. The crisis intervention team was legitimate, but they'd been fed false information by people they had no reason to doubt. Dr. Martinez was actually concerned about my well-being and frustrated when she realized she'd been manipulated into participating in what was essentially a kidnapping attempt. When I calmly explained the situation and provided documentation of the threats I'd been receiving, she recognized that someone had used her professional obligation to help people as a weapon against an innocent person. "This is highly irregular," she told her colleagues after reviewing the evidence I'd prepared. "These allegations don't match the person I'm speaking with, and there are serious questions about the motives of the people making these reports." James stepped in at that point with legal documentation establishing that any psychiatric commitment would be challenged immediately in court, and that the people making the allegations were subjects of ongoing federal investigation for financial crimes. The crisis team left without taking action, but the attempt had served its purpose. It demonstrated that Derek and Charlotte were willing to use any method, legal or illegal, to neutralize the threat I represented. Vincent called me within hours of the failed commitment, his voice tense with urgency. "They're moving faster than we expected. Derek just liquidated $3 million in assets and transferred the money offshore. I think they're planning to run, but not before they deal with you permanently." We had to act immediately. The comprehensive evidence package we'd been assembling was ready, but releasing it meant exposing ourselves to retaliation before law enforcement could respond. Vincent had contacts in the FBI's Financial Crimes Division who'd been investigating the Wellington family's political corruption for months. They'd been building a case slowly, carefully, trying to avoid the political pressure that had killed previous investigations. James arranged a meeting with Special Agent Lisa Park, a career FBI investigator who'd spent 15 years working white-collar crime cases involving politically connected families. Agent Park was in her early 40s, with silver hair and the kind of direct manner that suggested she didn't intimidate easily. When we met her at a small coffee shop in Springfield, Massachusetts, she listened to our story with the careful attention of someone who'd seen similar cases before. "What you're describing fits a pattern we've been tracking," she said after reviewing our evidence. "The Wellington family has been on our radar for 2 years, but they've been careful to stay just below the threshold that would trigger a major investigation. Your inheritance case might be the lever we need to open up their entire operation." Agent Park explained that federal investigations of wealthy, politically connected families required overwhelming evidence because of the pressure that came from above when powerful people felt threatened. But the combination of Vincent's financial records, my grandmother's documentation of inheritance fraud, and the evidence of Derek's involvement in previous disappearances was enough to justify a full investigation under the RICO Act. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act was designed to combat organized crime, but it applied perfectly to the Wellington and Crawford family's systematic pattern of fraud, money laundering, and elimination of threats. If we could prove that the families were operating as a criminal enterprise, everyone involved would face decades in federal prison. Charlotte's final desperate move came 3 days after our meeting with Agent Park. I received a call from the Hartford Police Department saying they'd received a report that I'd kidnapped my sister from a shopping mall in West Hartford. The caller explained that multiple witnesses had seen me force Charlotte into my car against her will, and that her fiancé was frantic with worry about her safety. The accusation was absurd, since I'd been meeting with James Morrison and Agent Park in Springfield all day, with dozens of witnesses and security cameras to prove it. But Derek and Charlotte weren't trying to create a convincing false story. They were trying to create enough chaos and confusion to justify immediate law enforcement action against me. When police arrived at my apartment with a warrant for my arrest on kidnapping charges, I was ready for them. James had prepared legal documentation proving my whereabouts, and Agent Park had already contacted the Hartford police to warn them that they were being used as weapons in a federal investigation. The false kidnapping report backfired spectacularly. Instead of getting me arrested, it provided additional evidence of Derek and Charlotte's willingness to file false police reports and manipulate law enforcement. More importantly, it prompted the FBI to accelerate their investigation timeline. Agent Park called me that evening with news that changed everything. "We're moving forward with federal warrants tomorrow morning. The U.S. Attorney's Office has authorized a full RICO investigation based on the evidence you and Vincent provided. Derek Wellington, Charlotte Crawford, and at least 6 other family members and associates will be arrested simultaneously." After months of feeling helpless and alone, I was finally going to see justice. But as I'd learned throughout this nightmare, nothing involving the Wellington and Crawford families was ever simple. The final battle was about to begin, and it would determine not just my future, but whether Derek and Charlotte would pay for the people they'd killed to protect their secrets. The federal raids began at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday in October, coordinated across 4 states to prevent any of the targets from warning each other or destroying evidence. I watched from Agent Park's car as FBI agents served search warrants at the Crawford family mansion, Derek's downtown office, Charlotte's apartment, and 12 other locations connected to their criminal enterprise. The sight of Charlotte being led out of her luxury apartment in handcuffs was something I'd dreamed about for months, but seeing it happen felt surreal. She looked smaller than I remembered, less commanding without her designer clothes and carefully applied makeup. When she saw the news cameras, she tried to cover her face, but the photographers had been waiting for hours. Derek's arrest was more dramatic. He'd been meeting with his father and several business associates at the Wellington family compound when federal agents surrounded the property. According to Agent Park, Derek had tried to destroy documents in a fireplace while his father made frantic phone calls to political allies who could no longer help them. The scope of the federal investigation was larger than even Vincent had realized. The FBI had been tracking the Wellington family's activities for 3 years, building cases against not just Derek and Charlotte, but Senator Richard Wellington, my parents, Uncle Robert, the family lawyer Mr. Peterson, and a dozen other people involved in their money laundering and murder conspiracy. The evidence Vincent and I had provided had been the final piece federal prosecutors needed to move forward, but they'd already been investigating Derek for the disappearance of Jennifer Walsh. They'd found her body 6 months earlier, buried on property owned by Derek's security company, but they'd kept that discovery secret while building their case. Charlotte's first instinct was to save herself by throwing everyone else under the bus. Within hours of her arrest, she was offering to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. She claimed that Derek had manipulated her into participating in illegal activities, that she'd been afraid to resist because of his threats, and that she'd never intended for anyone to get hurt. But Derek had anticipated that possibility. Among the documents seized from his office were detailed records of Charlotte's participation in planning Jennifer Walsh's murder. Charlotte hadn't just been complicit, she'd been the one who suggested targeting Jennifer and had helped plan the logistics of her disappearance. Derek had kept those records as insurance, ensuring that Charlotte could never betray him without implicating herself in capital murder charges. When Charlotte realized that Derek's evidence could put her on death row, she changed tactics again. Now she claimed that Derek had forced her to participate by threatening our parents, that everything she'd done was to protect the family from his violence. But federal prosecutors had recordings of Charlotte discussing Jennifer's murder in terms that made clear she was a willing participant, not a coerced victim. My parents' world collapsed completely when federal agents seized all of Crawford Properties' financial records and froze their assets pending investigation. Dad had been trying to distance himself from Charlotte and Derek since the FBI raids began, claiming he'd been unaware of their criminal activities, but the evidence showed he'd been actively involved in money laundering for years. Mom's participation was even more extensive. She'd been the one managing the complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts that hid the family's illegal profits. When federal investigators analyzed the financial records, they found that she'd personally overseen the movement of more than $30 million in illegal funds over the past 5 years. Uncle Robert's betrayal of my investigation had been motivated by more than family loyalty. Federal prosecutors discovered that he'd been stealing from the family business for years, using his position as chief financial officer to skim money from client accounts and construction contracts. Charlotte had discovered his theft and used it to control him, threatening to expose him unless he helped undermine my investigation. The revelation that my entire family had been involved in criminal activities while systematically destroying my life was almost overwhelming. These weren't just people who'd chosen favoritism over fairness, they were criminals who'd stolen, murdered, and conspired to eliminate anyone who threatened their illegal empire. The most shocking revelation came when Agent Park called me with news about the scope of Derek's crimes. The private security company Derek used for his problem-solving had been involved in the disappearances of 11 people over the past 7 years, not just the 3 Vincent had known about. Federal investigators had discovered a mass grave site on property owned by the security company, containing remains that included Jennifer Walsh and several other people who'd posed threats to wealthy clients. Derek's operation wasn't just about protecting the Wellington and Crawford families. He'd been running a murder-for-hire service that catered to wealthy individuals and families who needed inconvenient people eliminated. Charlotte had known about all of it and had helped recruit new clients through her social connections. When Derek realized that his empire was crumbling and that he faced multiple life sentences, he made one final attempt to eliminate the witnesses against him. Vincent received a call from someone claiming to be a federal prosecutor, asking him to come to a meeting to discuss his testimony. Only Vincent's paranoia and careful verification procedures prevented him from walking into what federal agents later determined was an ambush. The attempt on Vincent's life was the final straw for federal prosecutors. They moved immediately to arrest the remaining members of Derek's security team and seized additional properties where they found evidence of even more crimes. By the time the federal investigation was complete, more than 30 people had been arrested in connection with the conspiracy, including 2 sitting judges who'd been taking bribes, several police officers who'd been covering up crimes, and a network of lawyers, accountants, and business associates who'd been helping hide illegal activities. My family's real estate empire, built on my grandmother's honest hard work, had become the foundation for a criminal organization that had murdered innocent people and corrupted law enforcement across multiple states. Everything I'd believed about my childhood, my family, and my place in the world had been a lie designed to hide monstrous crimes. The federal trial that began 8 months later was one of the largest organized crime prosecutions in Connecticut's history. The prosecution team, led by U.S. Attorney Michael Stevens, had assembled evidence spanning 7 years of criminal activity that included murder, money laundering, political corruption, inheritance fraud, and obstruction of justice. Derek Wellington faced the most serious charges. Federal prosecutors were seeking the death penalty for his role in 11 murders, including Jennifer Walsh and the other victims found in the mass grave. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including financial records, recorded conversations, witness testimony from his security team, and physical evidence linking him to multiple crime scenes. Charlotte's trial strategy focused on portraying herself as another victim of Derek's manipulation, but the prosecution had evidence that destroyed that narrative. They played recordings of Charlotte laughing while discussing Jennifer Walsh's fear in her final days, emails where Charlotte suggested additional targets for elimination, and financial records showing she'd personally profited from every aspect of their criminal enterprise. Watching Charlotte testify in her own defense was surreal. She wore conservative clothes and spoke in a soft voice, trying to project vulnerability and remorse. But when prosecutors questioned her about specific crimes, her mask slipped, revealing flashes of the cold calculation that had driven her actions for years. "You planned Jennifer Walsh's murder because you were jealous of her relationship with Derek, isn't that correct?" Prosecutor Sarah Mitchell asked during cross-examination. "That's not true," Charlotte replied, but her voice was sharp with anger. "Jennifer was going to destroy everything we'd built. She was trying to tear down 2 families out of spite. So you decided she deserved to die?" "I decided she needed to be stopped." That exchange, broadcast on national news, showed the jury exactly who Charlotte really was. There was no remorse, no acknowledgement that Jennifer Walsh had been an innocent woman trying to do her job. Charlotte saw herself as the victim in every situation, even when she was the one inflicting harm. Derek's trial was even more damaging to their defense. When faced with evidence of his multiple murders, his money laundering operation, and his systematic corruption of law enforcement, Derek's lawyers tried to argue that he'd been protecting his family from dangerous people. But the prosecution's evidence showed that Derek had been killing people for profit, not protection. Vincent's testimony was devastating to both defendants. He calmly described Derek's boasts about eliminating problems, Charlotte's enthusiastic participation in planning murders, and the systematic way they'd corrupted anyone who could expose their crimes. Vincent's decision to come forward had probably saved my life, but it also meant he'd have to live with the knowledge of crimes he'd witnessed but hadn't initially reported. My parents' trials were separate but equally damning. Federal prosecutors had evidence showing that they'd known about Charlotte and Derek's criminal activities and had actively participated in money laundering and fraud. Dad's defense was that he'd been intimidated into cooperating, but recordings showed him enthusiastically discussing ways to expand their illegal operations. Mom's trial revealed the full extent of her financial crimes. She'd been the mastermind behind the complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts that had hidden more than $50 million in illegal profits. She'd also been the one who'd altered my grandmother's will, working with lawyer Peterson to steal my inheritance and cover up the theft. Uncle Robert pled guilty to embezzlement and agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors, but his testimony revealed additional crimes that expanded the case even further. The corruption had reached into city government, state regulators, and federal agencies, requiring additional investigations that continued long after the primary trials ended. The verdicts, when they finally came, delivered justice that exceeded my hopes. Derek was sentenced to death for the murders and received multiple life sentences for his other crimes. Charlotte received 25 years to life for her role in the murders and additional time for fraud and money laundering. She would likely die in federal prison. My parents each received 15-year sentences, which meant they'd be in their 70s when released, if they lived that long. Uncle Robert received 8 years in exchange for his cooperation. Lawyer Peterson received 12 years and was permanently disbarred. But the criminal convictions were only part of the justice. Federal prosecutors had seized all assets connected to the criminal enterprise, including the family mansion, Crawford Properties, Derek's business holdings, and offshore accounts containing more than $80 million in illegal profits. Under federal forfeiture laws, victims of the crime could claim compensation from the seized assets. My grandmother's stolen inheritance was restored with interest, but more importantly, I was entitled to additional compensation as the primary victim of their inheritance fraud conspiracy. The civil lawsuits that followed the criminal trials resulted in additional compensation. I sued Charlotte, Derek, my parents, and their various business entities for damages related to the theft of my inheritance, the intentional infliction of emotional distress, and the defamation campaign that had destroyed my reputation and career. When all the legal proceedings were complete, my total compensation was $87 million, significantly more than my original inheritance would have been. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family's greed and cruelty had ultimately made me wealthier than I ever would have been if they'd simply honored my grandmother's wishes. But more important than the money was the vindication. Every person who'd believed Charlotte's lies about me, who'd avoided me or treated me as unstable, now knew the truth. The woman who'd been portrayed as a jealous, mentally ill sister was actually the victim of a criminal conspiracy that had included murder. As the criminal cases concluded and I watched Derek and Charlotte led away to federal prison in shackles, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year: peace. The people who'd tried to destroy me were facing consequences for their actions, and I was finally free to rebuild my life on my own terms. 5 years later, I'm sitting on the front porch of my farmhouse in rural Vermont, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink that no amount of money could buy. The irony of my story isn't lost on me. The family that tried to destroy me for being unworthy of wealth ultimately made me wealthy beyond anything I could have imagined. But the real transformation wasn't financial, it was learning to trust again, to love again, and to build a life based on authentic relationships rather than obligation or manipulation. The Hazel Crawford Foundation has become my life's work, helping victims of financial fraud and family abuse rebuild their lives and seek justice. We've assisted over 3,000 families in the past 4 years, providing legal support, counseling services, and emergency financial assistance to people whose stories echo my own. Some cases involve inheritance theft, others family business fraud, but they all share the common thread of trusted people betraying those who should have been able to count on their protection. Working with fraud victims taught me something I hadn't expected. My story, as devastating as it felt while I was living through it, was actually one of the success stories. I had resources that many victims don't have. I found allies like James Morrison and Vincent Torres who were willing to risk their safety to help me. I discovered evidence that proved my case and prosecutors willing to act on that evidence. Many victims never get justice, never recover their stolen assets, never see their abusers face consequences. That reality motivated me to create something that could help other people fight battles similar to mine. The foundation employs investigators, lawyers, counselors, and financial advisors who specialize in cases involving family financial abuse. We've developed protocols for documenting evidence, protecting victims from retaliation, and working with law enforcement agencies that might not understand the complexities of family financial crimes. James Morrison became more than my investigator, he became the love of my life and my partner in both justice and healing. We married 3 years ago in a small ceremony attended by the friends who'd supported us through the darkest times. James understands the trauma of betrayal in ways that most people couldn't, having spent his career helping victims of financial crimes. He also understands the importance of building something positive from painful experiences. Our wedding was everything Charlotte's would have been if it had actually happened. Genuine, intimate, based on real love rather than social climbing or financial gain. We exchanged vows we'd written ourselves in front of 20 people who actually cared about our happiness, rather than hundreds of guests attending for business networking or social obligation. Vincent Torres has become one of my closest friends and serves on the foundation's board of directors. His courage in coming forward saved my life and brought justice for Jennifer Walsh and the other victims of Derek's crimes. He's also rebuilt his life, starting a legitimate consulting business that helps other people escape abusive business relationships before they become criminal conspiracies. Uncle Robert served his full 8-year sentence and was released 6 months ago. He reached out to me through intermediaries, asking if we could meet to discuss his remorse and desire to make amends. I considered his request carefully, discussing it with James and my therapist, Dr. Sarah Kim, who'd helped me work through the trauma of family betrayal. I ultimately decided to meet with Uncle Robert, not because I was ready to forgive him, but because I was curious about whether he'd genuinely changed or was simply trying to manipulate me into helping him rebuild his life. The meeting, held at a neutral location with James present, was uncomfortable but illuminating. Uncle Robert looked older than his 62 years, with gray hair and the defeated posture of someone who'd lost everything he'd valued. He apologized sincerely for betraying my investigation and acknowledged that his actions had nearly gotten me killed. But he also tried to minimize his role in the larger conspiracy, portraying himself as someone who'd made mistakes rather than someone who'd actively participated in criminal activities. I was stealing money, yes, he said, but I never knew about the murders. I never would have been part of that. I listened to his explanations and apologies, but I didn't feel the anger I'd expected. Instead, I felt sad for him, for all of us, for how greed and fear had destroyed what should have been loving family relationships. Uncle Robert would have to live with the consequences of his choices, but those consequences were no longer my responsibility to manage. My parents are still serving their sentences in federal prison. I've received letters from both of them over the years, apologizing and asking for forgiveness, but I haven't responded. Some wounds are too deep for simple apologies to heal, especially when those apologies come only after the people who inflicted the wounds have been caught and punished. Dr. Kim helped me understand that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation, and healing doesn't require maintaining relationships with people who've proven themselves capable of profound betrayal. I've forgiven my parents in the sense that I no longer carry anger toward them, but I've also accepted that they're not safe people for me to have in my life. Charlotte and Derek are both serving their sentences in maximum security federal prisons, and I hope I never see either of them again. Sometimes I wonder if Charlotte thinks about the different life she could have lived if she'd chosen honesty over manipulation, cooperation over competition. But those thoughts don't linger long. Charlotte made her choices knowing the harm they would cause, and she'll have the rest of her life to contemplate those decisions. The money that was stolen from me has been completely restored, with interest and additional compensation that left me wealthier than I'd ever imagined being. But living with significant wealth taught me something unexpected. Money amplifies who you already are, but it doesn't fundamentally change your character. If you're generous and ethical, wealth allows you to be generous and ethical on a larger scale. If you're selfish and dishonest, wealth just makes those flaws more dangerous. I use my money to fund the foundation's work, to support other nonprofits that help vulnerable people, and to live simply but comfortably with James on our farm. We grow vegetables, raise chickens, and host retreats for fraud victims who need time and space to heal. It's not the life I'd planned when I was 28 and working at that tech startup, but it's a life built on purpose and authentic relationships. The most important lesson I learned through this experience is that family isn't defined by blood or legal relationships, it's defined by the people who choose to love and support you consistently, especially when doing so requires sacrifice. James, Vincent, Agent Park, Mrs. Chen, and even Dr. Kim became more family to me than the people who shared my genes and my childhood home. My grandmother would be proud of what I've built from the inheritance she tried to protect for me. Not just the financial success, but the choice to use painful experiences to help other people facing similar battles. She believed in justice, in protecting vulnerable people, and in the importance of standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. Looking back on everything that happened, I can see that being expelled from my family was actually a gift, though it took years for me to recognize it as such. Being forced to build a new life from nothing taught me resilience, independence, and the difference between people who genuinely care about me and people who were simply using me or tolerating me out of obligation. The people who tried to destroy me did me a favor by showing me their true character before I wasted more years hoping they might change. Charlotte's cruelty, my parents' willingness to sacrifice me for their other daughter, Uncle Robert's betrayal, all of these painful experiences taught me to value authentic relationships and to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. I still think about Jennifer Walsh sometimes, wondering what her life might have been like if she'd had the allies and resources that ultimately saved me. Her courage in investigating Derek's family, even knowing the personal and professional risks, helped provide the evidence that eventually brought him down. In some ways, she saved my life even though she couldn't save her own. The foundation has established the Jennifer Walsh Memorial Fund, which provides emergency protection and relocation assistance for people whose lives are threatened because of their efforts to expose financial crimes. We've helped 47 people in the past 3 years, and I believe Jennifer would be proud of how her sacrifice has been honored. If you're watching this and you're facing betrayal from people you trusted, whether it's family members, business partners, or friends, I want you to know that survival is possible. Justice is possible. Healing is possible. The people who are trying to destroy you don't define your worth or determine your future. Build authentic relationships with people who support you consistently, document everything, trust your instincts, and don't be afraid to fight for what's right. Sometimes the people who seem most powerful are actually the most vulnerable, because their power depends on keeping their secrets hidden. Most importantly, remember that your value as a person isn't determined by other people's treatment of you. My family's cruelty didn't make me worthless, just like their money didn't make them worthy. Character is revealed through choices, especially choices made when no one is watching or when doing the right thing is difficult. The farm where James and I live now sits on land that's been farmed for over 200 years. The previous owners faced droughts, floods, economic disasters, family conflicts, and every other challenge that comes with building something lasting. But they persisted, adapting to circumstances while maintaining their core values, and they created something beautiful that has sustained multiple generations. That's what healing looks like. Not forgetting the past or pretending it didn't hurt, but using those experiences to build something meaningful that can help other people facing similar challenges. Pain can become purpose if you choose to transform it rather than just endure it. What happened to your family when the truth finally came out? Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your own well-being? Share your experiences in the comments below, because your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to realize they're not alone. Don't forget to hit that like button if this story resonated with you, subscribe for more true stories about overcoming family betrayal and financial abuse, and share this video with anyone who might need to hear that justice is possible even when the odds seem impossible. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for being part of a community that supports survivors and believes in the power of truth over lies, courage over fear, and authentic love over manipulative control. Remember, your worth isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you choose to treat yourself and others, especially when it's difficult. Take care of yourselves, trust your instincts, and never stop fighting for the life you deserve.